Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, we're back with some more Fat Electrician, and I need to catch up on some of the back catalog because I was late coming to this channel. And I know this should be a good one. It's called 450 Marines versus the Imperial Japanese Navy, Wake Island. All right, we got World War II in the Pacific, and you know we're gonna have a great story to hear. All right, this original video is linked down below. Make sure you're supporting the Fat Electrician. Please like his video, sub to his channel, then come on back and we'll check this out together. Let's get started. All right, so if you're new here, I'm going to try to add any history that I can to go along with this video and help you get a bigger picture. Let's see what we got here.
During World War II, the Japanese military used to think that the Marines were all recruited from prisons and insane asylums, which, to be honest, it's always made sense to me. But after researching for this video, it's starting to make dollars.
Not Marines. That you don't just draft Marines or something. That there's a lot of vetting for that. I come a family that has Marines.
Today we're talking about the first time that the United States Marine Corps would come toe-to-toe with the Japanese military. Ladies and gentlemen, Wake Island, a small coral atoll 2,000 miles west of Hawaii, closer to Japan than it was to America, and highly sought after by the Japanese to be a forward operating base for World War II. The only problem with that was, it was currently held by the Americans. 450 Marine Corps artillerymen and 1,200 civilian construction workers, as well as 70 Navy corpsmen. In this context, for the layman, if you don't know, Navy corpsman is a fancy word for Marine Corps medic, aka doc. And they didn't have
okay. You know, when you look at a map of important like World War II islands, and something that you'll see that's always amazes me when I look is how small they are. Like literally some of these islands are just big enough to have a runway. All right. And it's amazing how important those were because the Pacific is so freaking huge of how critical these islands that would be like 2 miles long, you know, if that.
Much to defend the island with, but they did have 6 5-inch coastal artillery guns that were actually taken from America's first ever battleship, the original USS Texas from the 1800s. They also had 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 18 M2 Browning machine guns, 30 Browning 30 caliber machine guns, as well as 12 Grumman F4F Wildcat fighters. In regards to time, Wake Island is 22 hours ahead of Hawaii, meaning that from their perspective, Pearl Harbor would take place on December 8th, 1941. An hour after the attack on Pearl Harbor had ended, Wake would receive a transmission saying that
December
Pearl Harbor
7th, Hawaii,
and that they needed to be prepared. 2 hours after that, 27 Japanese bombers would conduct an air raid on Wake Island, destroying 8 of their 12 F4F Wildcat fighters before they even left the airstrip.
A lot of people forget that Pearl Harbor was only one of many coordinated attacks across the Pacific. It was, you know, the most notable one that kind of started it, but it was multiple things. The Philippines being another one that saw a massive invasion.
At this point, 400 civilian construction workers would volunteer to help fight if it came to that, and the Marines began training them on how to operate machine guns immediately, while also fortifying fighting
and how to stab with
Wake Island would then be bombed again on the 9th, and on December 11th, 1941, an entire Japanese naval detachment would arrive at Wake Island, and the battle for Wake would officially begin. As the Marines, the Navy corpsmen, and the construction workers rushed to their battle stations, they would see that they were incredibly outmanned and outgunned. The Japanese had brought with them 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 3 submarines, 1 submarine tender, 2 PT boats, and 2 amphibious landing ships equipped with 450 special naval landing forces of the Japanese, which is essentially the Japanese equivalent of Marines.
By the way, all those attacks that were coordinated again are in that second week of December. They all looked like that as far as just like Americans being totally unprepared, but being at such small odds compared to what the Japanese brought. Saw it at Pearl Harbor, saw it in the Philippines. You can see it here. Just how big these attacks were is huge.
As the entire Japanese naval detachment advanced closer and closer to the island, they would finally come within striking distance of the Marine artillery, 12,000 yards. Despite that, and much to the confusion of the Marines, they were all ordered to hold their fire, which made absolutely no sense to them. These men could hit bullseyes at 12,000 yards. These guys would put a fucking 5-inch shell through a bedroom window if they wanted to. Why on earth are they being told to hold their fire? But the man in charge of the Marines, Commander Devereaux, realized that the Japanese artillery on the ships actually outranged the Marine artillery, and they weren't firing yet. And this must mean that the Japanese thought that their air raids had disabled all of the Marine defenses on the island, which was not true at all, because in reality, the only thing they had taken out was the original 8 Wildcats from day 1. So under the command of Major Devereaux, the Marines—
There were 12, he said there. Didn't they say they're 12s? They took out 8 of the 12.
Continue to hold their fire and play possum as the entire detachment
be hard to counter
closer and closer. 10,000 yards, 8,000 yards, 6,000 yards. 4,000 yards, which as far as a Marine artilleryman is concerned, is point blank fucking range. If they got any closer, these Marines were going to try to put a bayonet on this 5-inch gun, okay? The Marines would finally be given the order to open fire, and they would open fire with everything they had and put as many shells downrange as they possibly could, taking the Japanese completely off guard and hitting almost all of their ships with effective fire.
Kind of lured them in.
They were able to sink one of the destroyers by hitting it twice in its magazine. The destroyer Hayate would be sunk in 12 minutes.
Damn. So yeah, this sounds so risky to just like hold back like that. It'd be scary.
And I cannot stress to you what a big deal this is. At this point in time, Japan has effectively attacked Pearl Harbor and 27 other locations in the Pacific, and they have never.
I didn't know the exact number. That's actually more than I thought. 27. I didn't think it got that high, but holy cow! Don't forget that, and let people know Pearl Harbor was the most, devastating and enigmatic that way. But it's just one of many things going on. It's war. Japan is at war with the United States.
And it took the Marine artillerymen 12 minutes to put one completely under the waterline. Panicking and not knowing what to do, the Japanese naval detachment would turn and retreat. And it is at this point that they would realize that they made a fatal flaw in their attack strategy because they didn't bring a carrier and they brought no planes for air support. Cue this man, Henry Elrod, aka Hammer and Hank, and one of the first main characters that would ever enter the battlefield in World War II on America's behalf. Himself and the other 3 Grumman Wildcat fighters would take off into the sky. They would realize that the Japanese naval detachment came with no carrier and no airplanes overhead. And let's face it, Japanese AA guns might as well be crewed by fucking stormtroopers because they can't hit shit. So
I was gonna say, like, okay, they have no carriers. By the way, carriers sent to Pearl Harbor there, so they could, do the plane attacks. That's how Pearl Harbor went down. But I was still thinking though, like, the ships, their battleships are still gonna have surface to air, weaponry. But yeah, sounds like if it's stormtroopers, that just gives all the context you need.
Wildcat pilots take off and proceed to kick the entire naval detachment in the ass on the way out as they strafe their decks with machine gun fire and drop 100-pound bombs on their
tiny little unit.
Now, a 100-pound bomb and machine gun fire absolutely should never be able to sink a major naval vessel, like ever. Good old Hammer and Hank, though, managed to park one of those 100-pound bombs directly on top of the depth charges on top of the deck of the destroyer Kisarage, setting off a chain reaction that would sink the entire naval vessel, which is literally the
You see that?
Major
we got to watch that again.
Like ever. Good old Hammer and Hank, though, managed to park one of those 100-pound bombs directly on top of the depth charges on top of the deck of the destroyer Kisarage,
so much ignited there.
Reaction that would sink the entire naval vessel, which is literally the equivalent of killing a grown-ass man with a BB gun, but somehow he pulled it off anyways. Which, I mean, to be fair, is just standard behavior for the Marine Corps at this point. Now, the smoke settles from the battle, and they have to figure out what all happened, because, there's a lot of moving parts. Come to find...
By the way, big picture here. Too, when it comes to this naval war, these are things, these ships, right, that they lose, the Japanese are losing, are going to be difficult yet almost impossible to replace. The United States, it was pretty amazing with how devastating like Pearl Harbor was, how many ships they lost, how quickly the Americans were able to reproduce stuff. The Japanese couldn't come close to that rate. And the materials, not nearly as many of the materials. So like this is stuff that the Japanese will never recover from, but stuff the United States may lose in this will be recovered quite easily.
Find out the only thing that the Marines lost, 2 of the planes were so damaged that they weren't going to be flyable anymore. So now they're only down to 2 Grumman Wildcats, and only 5 people had been injured. Nobody died on the American side. Japan, on the other hand, had lost 2 destroyers, a submarine, and a suspected 300+ men. Needless to say, the Japanese are fucking pissed and embarrassed about this entire thing. Which, I mean, they kind of have a right to be upset too. I mean, this was the first 2 ships they've had sunk during World War II. This was the first tactical loss they've had, and this is the only successful amphibious landing defense using coastal artillery ever in all of World War II. They straight up kind of got their asses whooped. And because they're so upset, they pretty much immediately sent out another air raid from the Marshall Islands and bombed Wake Island again, and they continued to...
I'm sorry, I got to go back about 10 seconds. If you heard me mouthing something, but not coming through, my dog got into something he wasn't supposed to, but I didn't want to stop the video. So I was sternly addressing him.
Straight up kind of got their asses whooped. And because they're so upset, they pretty much immediately sent out another air raid from the Marshall Islands and bombed Wake Island again. And they continued to bomb Wake Island every day for the next 10 days. Thankfully, they still didn't manage to hit a whole lot. Total stormtrooper energy, just misses every single time. And during
these
this
islands
10
are
days,
tiny.
the American people would find out that 450 Marines and a bunch of construction workers stood up to the Japanese Navy and told them to get fucked. And this became the silver lining for the catastrophe that was Pearl Harbor.
You guys that know this better than me. So those kind of bombs, like if you were to hit, you know, the island there, how deep do your bunkers and stuff need to be able to be safe from that kind of thing? You know what I mean? Like, is there any safety in it? With what, you know, the Japanese are dropping. I know there's so many different types of bombs and different payloads and stuff like that, but, how can you be safe, right? Like if the bombs do hit.
Wake Island was a shining example that the American public looked to and said, if those 450 dudes were able to accomplish that when they weren't ready, imagine what we're going to be able to do once we actually start trying. This victory, unfortunately, would be short-lived because it is now a race between Japan and America to see who can get reinforcements to Wake Island first.
See, it's such a difference. Like you mentioned with Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor did a horrible job defending Pearl Harbor. Horrible. There's two waves of attack that came about an hour apart or so, that the Japanese had, were like uninterrupted. Couldn't get the planes off the ground. It was so successful from the Japanese. Nothing like Wake Island.
Problem with that is the Japanese reinforcements are coming from all their other successful attack missions, including Pearl Harbor, so they have a huge head start on the Americans. So obviously they get all of their ships there first. So the Marines call up the Navy chain of command and are like, hey, there's a bunch of more Japanese ships here, including some aircraft carriers. Hurry up. At which point, the United States Navy, or maybe not the Navy, but the government, somebody at a high level decides that, well, we don't want to lose any more ships, so we're just going to consider all of Wake Island collateral damage, and we're going to leave all of you there to die.
Same thing happened to the Philippines. Basically, they told him MacArthur was stationed there, said, you just have to leave. I know you got thousands of troops out there still. Those guys went into horrible prison camps, like with the Bataan Death March. It showed how unprepared and how unable the Americans were to be able to counter this kind of stuff. And logistically in the Pacific, again, it's so huge that it's like impossible to get stuff, you know, like reinforcements quickly. Stuff takes days and days and days.
I wish I was joking.
Yeah.
So the first battle for Wake Island was on December 11th. They then got bombed every day for 10 days straight. It is now December 22nd. They have all been left there to die, except these are United States Marines. So fuck it. We're still going to fight anyways, because that's just how they get down. So December 22nd, 1941, the second battle for Wake Island is about to kick off. In the red, white, and blue corner, we have 450 Marine artillerymen, 400 construction workers, and 70 Navy corpsmen, going toe-to-toe with a reinforced Japanese Navy of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 PT boats, 2 amphibious landing vehicles, a bunch of more amphibious landing soldiers, 1 submarine tender, 2 submarines, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 mine layers, and 2 aircraft carriers returning from Pearl Harbor. The IJN
How many planes are on the carriers?
And the IJN see you. Apparently the IJN smell you and taste you. Were fucking busy. And now, to the Marine Corps' surprise, the entire naval detachment refuses to get anywhere near this island, not willing to come within 12,000 yards because they don't want to get shot up by accurate Marine artillery fire again. So instead, what they do is they send out their 2 amphibious landing ships with 900 soldiers on them, and they deploy every single plane that their aircraft carriers have. The 2 remaining Marine Corps Wildcat fighters are about to go toe-to-toe with 50 Japanese aircraft. And somehow, those...
All right, pilots, each of you need to take down 25 enemy planes while you're also being shot at from the surface. 2
badass Marine aviators managed to shoot down 21 Japanese planes, one of which was the bomber of Bombardier Norobu Kanai, the man that was credited with sinking the USS Arizona. This would be considered the first ever revenge for Pearl Harbor. The remaining Japanese planes then proceeded to bomb and strafe the island with machine gun fire.
They almost took out half of them. I was like kidding. That's way more than I thought. Like way more. That's insane. Said Tony won, right? They had 50 and 2 planes to take out that many.
They didn't really do a whole lot of damage, but one thing they did take out was the communication lines leaving the command bunker where Major Devereaux was. And nobody knew that that had happened, so Major Devereaux's inside of his bunker giving orders, but nobody's hearing them. So when the 900 Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces landed on the beach and they weren't given any orders, the Marines are kind of like, what are we doing? What's the play? No orders came through, so they're gonna do what Marines do best, be default aggressive
Light 'em up.
and go fuck shit up. Given a lack of instruction, they will resort to destruction every single time. The Marines on their own accord decide that they are going to fix bayonets, leave the machine guns and fortified fighting positions with the civilians that they trained, and they are gonna go meet a 2-to-1 battle against the Japanese Special Landing Forces on the beach in the middle of bumfuck nowhere in the Pacific. One of these two groups is the best amphibious fighting force on Earth, and they are about to figure it out right now. For the next 11 hours, the Marine Corps and the Japanese Special Landing Forces would engage in close combat, and not only were the Marines successful at defending, they would begin launching counterattacks, and these counterattacks would fracture the enemy line, sending small groups of enemy soldiers all over the island. It is at this point, after like 11 hours, Commander Devereaux finally comes out of his fucking bunker after not hearing from anyone this entire time, and in his head, he's thinking all of the positions that had radios must have been overrun. That's why they're not responding to me, so he's anticipating that they're losing. And his
sorry, I'm not adding much right now because I'm like enthralled in the story. I want to add some history and stuff, but I looked at Wake Island at this amount of detail right now.
As soon as he walks out of the bunker, he sees Japanese flags all over the island, and he assumes that the flags had been hoisted because the Japanese were victorious. But that's not what was happening. What he was seeing was Japanese good luck flags, which was a Japanese tradition in World War II, where the Japanese soldiers would have their friends and family sign a Japanese flag, and they would hang it on their rifle when they went into battle for good luck. That is what he was seeing, not flags hoisted in victory, because his Marines were kicking their fucking ass.
So I didn't know that. While they're fighting, have that flag drop? That seems like it'd be such a bad idea.
But he didn't know that, so he proceeded to go around the island and force his men to surrender. Right off the bat, huge problem. The Japanese at this point in time weren't real big on the whole taking prisoners thing. They still very much believed in the Bushido Code of Honor, and if you surrendered on the battlefield, you lost that honor, and as far as they're concerned, if you didn't have your honor, you deserved to die. So it's already not looking that great, and it would become even worse once...
Japanese, you know, these guys at this time were kind of bred and built up to see themselves as 20th century samurai, like literally just like a new version of that, right? It was such a cultural sign of, or part of cultural strength of Japan. And yes, you had like the Meiji Restoration, which basically abolished the whole feudal system and samurai and all that stuff. But like, this was like, these guys were, they bred them to be like, again, like samurai 2.0.
Once the fog of the battle finally lifted and everybody began to look around and realize there's a distinct lack of dead Americans. Plenty of dead people, not many Americans. Because over the last 11 hours, the Japanese landing forces had suffered 600 casualties. And the Americans had only lost 52 Marines and 70 construction workers. I say only, that's still a lot. It's way too many. It's tragic. I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. Right. I'm simply trying to explain it was an extremely lopsided battle. And this would only serve to infuriate the Japanese even more. So the Japanese, now thoroughly pissed off, decide they are going to take every American on Wake Island, including the civilians that didn't even fight, and strip them all butt naked and tie them together in groups of 15 with telephone wire and march all 1,600 of them to the airfield. They then began assembling their crew-served machine guns, intending on executing everyone. They then stood there for 2 days on an airstrip, butt naked in the middle of the Pacific at gunpoint, until the Japanese admiral came out and announced to them that the Emperor of Japan had decided to grace them with their lives. You see, the American media had made such a big deal of the first defense of Wake Island that the entire world was watching the events unfold now, and Japan knew that they couldn't get away with committing such a mass atrocity without attracting too much attention.
You could list the Japanese atrocities up to this point when you think about them. Nanjing, we talk about that. Talk about Nanjing, Nanking as it's also called. Care about their PR then. The Japanese PR from what was coming out, already come out of mainland Asia, was horrible. All right, it was horrible. And yeah, I know they denied, you know, what came out of Nanking and all that stuff, but like it was part of the stuff that led to the US embargo as well, like the oil embargo. Of course, you know, it was mostly about responding to Japanese or American interests in the South or in the Pacific, right? Economic interests and stuff like that. But also just, disagreement with what Imperial Japan had been doing the last few years too. So interesting that this would be the hill they want to defend here for Japan and PR here at Wake Island.
So they decided they were going to actually have to abide by the rules of war and take prisoners.
I mean, thankful for
the majority
those
of the Americans would then be loaded onto cargo
Marines
ships and sent to
stuff.
prison camps either in Japan or Japanese-occupied China. And I'm happy to say that the overwhelming majority of them survived all of World War II in these POW camps and got to return home in 1945.
That's actually
and
crazy, dude. These guys are so
Upon
lucky.
returning home, they would find out that only months after their first defense of Wake Island, in 1942, Hollywood had turned their life events into a movie. But the problem with the movie was that nobody actually knew what happened at the second battle
Was
of
it all
Wake
messed
Island,
up?
so Hollywood just anticipated that everybody had died, and that's how the movie ended. Fast
Oh, anyone seen this? Check this out. Is it public domain now?
forward like 45 years later, there's a Wake Island reunion event where a journalist finally asks all the Marines what they thought of that movie when they first returned home. And without skipping a beat,
it's even
this
more
man
Hollywood,
in his 60s
though.
or 70s at this point chimes in and says, well, first of all, we didn't actually have a dog there. To which every other Marine began laughing, and it is hands down my favorite part of this story, because somehow that man lived through an entire lifetime worth of shit before he turned 25, and he has now made it into the twilight years of his life with his sense of humor intact and that innate burning desire to be a fucking smartass that every military member I've ever met has. And now the story's gonna get weird. Whatever became of
Well, I was gonna say, okay, what would be the better actual film adaptation? The real Wake Island story, or like a heroic everybody goes down 300 style? I don't know. I mean, the truth is stranger than any kind of fiction there, because I mean, you could build up such a suspenseful thing of, you know, those guys and they're tied up and they're on the runway, and then you could put some soldiers about to, you know, conduct the execution or whatever, and then at the last minute some Japanese guy comes running in and is like, no, the emperor says no. I don't know which would be the better film.
of Wake Island itself. While it would remain under Japanese control for the duration of World War II, every time an American naval vessel drove past it, they would open fire on it with its guns, and they would routinely perform air raids on the island. Now, as fate would have it, one of those air raids on Wake Island would be the very first combat mission of a new pilot that joined the military at the ass end of World War II, and that pilot's name was George Bush. Don't worry, it's gonna get weirder. Returning now to the men as they were currently serving as prisoners of war, the vast majority were held in POW camps in Japanese-occupied China. Of all the men held there, a single Marine would escape, and he would make his way all the way to northern China, where he would find a group of Chinese communist soldiers, also not super big fans of the Japanese at this point in time, and they would decide, hey, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I'm gonna make sure this Marine makes it home safe, and that's exactly what they did. And
so I think one of the most fascinating parts of the Pacific War, right, is how, you know, Japan invades 1937, large scale invasion of China, right in the midst of the Civil War, right? The nationalists versus the communists. And at that time, nationalists were kicking the butt of the communists, right? Before that, you had the Long March, and the communists are like, you know, trying to regroup. They're you know, losing people because of their being persecuted, and they're trekking across the country for safety and all that stuff. But amazing that, yeah, those two sides put their differences aside to fight Japan. It was, you know, like they said there, enemy of your enemy is your friend. So you got like Chiang Kai-shek and you got Mao Zedong. And they're like, hey, obviously we don't like each other, but we could both agree that we hate the Japanese more. And interestingly, as that war went on, the communist side ended up fighting and was more effective against the Japanese than the nationalists, who were like the military regime of China. And a lot of that being because of guerrilla warfare. The communists have been fighting guerrilla warfare styles for years now against the Kuomintang, and fared better. It also gave a lot more sympathy for them, and their party and their contingent grew. That we're talking about the communists here grew, and then by the time the World War II ended and the Civil War resumes, because that's what happens, the communists completely had flipped the script, and of course are going to win that Civil War. But it was their experience in World War II that really led to the flipping of that script with the communists fighting the Japanese.
Just as that Marine was about to set off on his final journey home, he would receive a visit from those soldiers' leader, and that leader would wish him well on his journey and gift him with several very nice Chinese rugs. That leader's name was Mao Zedong, the deadliest human of all time, credited with killing somewhere between 40 and 80 million people. Yeah, the truth is literally stranger than fiction, and all of this happening, I have so many questions, but most important of all, the one question I want an answer to more than anything: What do you think that guy did with the rugs? I mean, for real, on one hand, kind of weird to keep them, but on the other hand...
No, I don't care. I'm keeping those. Those are a treasure. I don't care.
And the rug didn't do anything, and it's a nice fucking rug. You know what I mean? Okay, this video is getting out of hand. I have to end it. In conclusion, after Pearl Harbor, the commander of the Japanese Navy, Admiral Yamamoto, would write in his personal diary, quote, "I fear all we have done is awoken a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve."
True.
And I personally find it ironic that the first time that his men would come face to face with that terrible resolve, the sleeping giant that they awoken, would be 3 days later at Wake Island, where 450 Marines, 70 Navy corpsmen, and 400 blue-collar construction workers stood together and halted the most powerful Navy on the planet in their tracks for 16 days. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. The best way to support the channel is go buy some merch at thefatelectrician.com. Quack bang, out.
Final thoughts. What an incredible story. What an incredible story, right? Of those odds there. Because man, this was the dark time for the Americans. This was the dark time for them at the beginning here of World War II, just getting punched, right? You take one right in the chin right there in December of 1941, and having so many people, die and are not going to get help and are going to be stranded and stuff, and having to think about what that would have been like to go through that when you are just completely on your own, right? And amazing with the odds against, those guys at Wake Island, they were able to, as many of them were able to come out and inflict the damage that they did, and send a message to the Japanese Navy to send one like that under those odds, there could still be some kind of success, even though they take that island. Look at the cost, right? So anyway, great story. He's so good at telling a great story. So thank you again, Fat Electrician, for the sharing that with us. Hopefully you guys are able to take a few things, kind of the bigger picture stuff that I was talking about, put that together, get a better picture here of World War II. All right, and with that, we'll see y'all next time.